Well, I want to say what a blessing it is to see so many pastors out on a Wednesday when Thursday. Well, I'll tell you what, we've been traveling all week. We've been in 5 venues in the last 4 days, and I'm lucky that I got the city right. We are in New York, are we not? I'm glad to be here in Orlando at the wonderful First Baptist Church. Thank you for driving through all that traffic to be here and for giving this day up. I'm going to do something that will at least reward you pastors somewhere down the line. This is a morning that many of you be laboring over the message for Sunday morning. Of course, some of you guys probably have your sermons written 3 months in advance. I usually did mine on Saturday and afternoon into the late hours. I'm not bragging about that, but it seemed like there was always something that was causing the schedule to fall apart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the heart of a message that I delivered to First Baptist Church of Pearland, Texas, where I was the privileged to be their senior pastor for 12 years, on a Sunday, close to July 4th, celebrating freedom, with John Ashcroft there as our guest soloist. I don't know if you are aware that he is an Assembly of God a preacher. He's been ordained in the past. His father was a preacher. He is a gifted musician, sings wonderfully. Our people enjoyed hearing him sing more than they heard him speak. But the morning I delivered this message, after he had sung and shared his testimony, he said, "Preacher, you got to put that sermon in print." So I figured if a senator and an attorney general tells you to do something, if it's legal, you ought to do it. So I did. And I'm going to give you an outline that you can walk out here this afternoon and preach. It's just that easy, flows that simply out of the text, and we'll see that in a moment. But before I do, I'm going to hit a few buttons. God help me when I do this. It gets dangerous. I'm learning how to use an iPad. It really is handy, but I just learned how to do email a couple of weeks ago, so this is a challenge for me. I want you to meet someone who wrote a paper that's in the packet. When you leave in a moment for a break and come back, we don't have enough of these for everyone, but we have about 100 of them, and I want every senior pastor to leave with this packet full of information, including the sermon I'm about to preach in printed form. But there's also a one-pager entitled, "Can a Christian Vote for a Non-Christian?" This was written by Hugh Welchel. He is a distinguished theologian in his own right. He is the executive director of the Institute of Faith, Work, and Economics. I would really encourage you to write down this website for reference because there's a plethora of information, blogs and other things that are written there that you'll find some excellent resource for preaching. It's www.tifwe.org, tifwe.org. But Hugh, just stand up if you will. I'd like to thank you for being here this morning. And let's give this man a wonderful round of applause. I have a stopwatch. I'm watching my time. They told me I had to let you out here by 12 o'clock. You know, they taught me in seminary, if you want to be a popular preacher, always have the crowd out by 12 o'clock. I have a half hour, and I'm going to observe that. But I want to take the time to say something about a man that he will not say this about himself, and that's John Stemberger. Fellas, here's a man called to the legal field, just like many of you have been called to preach. The reason I admire John so very much is because he could be making a good, solid salary and not have to deal with people like you and I every day of his life, but he surrendered the talent of legal expertise and much training to serve pastors across this state and others for that matter. I work with family policy councils in states all over the country. In fact, if there is a family policy council, before I do the first event, I go and meet the director because I know that will be an organization that will be helpful in giving information to pastors and helping them long after we're gone. But I know of no family policy council more effective in any state than this one, and I attribute that to the solid work of John and his staff, and he deserves our prayers. I would encourage you to take that sheet home and consider how your church could make Family Policy Council in Florida a missionary endeavor. Not being paid to say that, might get in trouble for saying that, but John, I for one am very grateful for the work that you do, the solid, faithful work. And then finally, you can't say enough about Dr. Grudem. I had known of him, never met him until Monday, and I'll tell you, what a unique picture of a man who walks in the Spirit with a depth theologically that few men possess. And when they were telling all of his credentials, I walked over to Bill and I said, I'm none of those things. I mean, he's a Harvard graduate. I can barely spell Harvard. He's a man who's been exposed to the highest levels of academia, and yet it hasn't soured him. Isn't it refreshing to be around a man like that and practical in application? So we are privileged today to be here to discuss these things and to be led by such men. You know, we're in a mess in this country. You agree or disagree? America's not going to survive if something doesn't happen. Now, here's the promise, the good word for all of us. We've been here before. We've talked some about the American Revolution. We all look back at the Founding Fathers and see the significant role they played in establishing the freest nation in the history of the world, a fountainhead of evangelism for the world. But all of that took place because of the preaching of men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, who created the environment for the First Great Awakening that empowered those early settlers who came here seeking freedom to worship and freedom to conduct their lives, to take up arms against the most powerful military force in the history of the world. And they did that because of the faith they possessed and because of the renewal they had experienced that gave them the courage to fight the fight. Courage is not the absence of fear, ladies and gentlemen. It's the willingness to do what's right in spite of your fear. And I'm certain that when they stood there out front of the Brattle Street church with those arms against the troops that came storming down on them and ultimately killed 34 of them, I'm sure they were quaking and I'm sure they were frightened, but they did what was right in spite of their fear. And here was their rallying cry: we have no king but Jesus. I'll tell you, they didn't get that from the military minds. They got that from the preachers. And it was the First Great Awakening that gave us America. But you know, they didn't get it right for a lot of reasons. They allowed slavery to stay in place. And by the mid-1800s, slavery was embedded into the fabric of the economics of America. And there were preachers and others who didn't believe America could survive if slavery was suddenly thrown out, because of men like John Quincy Adams, who after being president went back into the U.S. Congress, the only president ever willing to submit himself in such fashion, for one solitary reason: to end slavery. Inspired by John Wilberforce, dedicated his life to that cause. Ultimately, it resulted in bloodshed and the death of 500,000 Americans or more, 600,000 plus. But what preceded that was the preaching of Charles Finney, who literally went from one end of the known parts of America at that time to the other, preaching that slavery was a filthy sin and that America would be judged by God. And finally, through the purging and sacrifice of blood, this country set itself free from the tyranny of slavery. Well, here we are, fast forward 150 years later, with a far greater tyranny, a tyranny of abortion. 60 million dead and counting. Here we are with a culture now embracing what God calls a horrible sin, a filthy sin of homosexuality. Here we are, fast forward, at a time when this country is expunging God from the public place. And I'm telling you, all around us now are all the harbingers of judgment. And the only thing that's going to save us is a third great awakening. It will not be a political solution. But the way you'll know that awakening came is people will look back and godly men and women began voting their values. Godly men and women began pursuing public office. Godly men and women began rewriting the course of our history by doing what is right. And that's what we're here today to talk about. Let me give you a simple little outline you can preach Sunday morning. You can play golf the rest of the week. Paul and Silas, on that second missionary journey, were endeavoring to go back to Asia and strengthen the churches that Paul and Barnabas had established. We all know that story. In the middle of the night, God awakened Paul in his sleep, spoke to his heart, and said, "Don't go to the churches in Asia as you have planned. I have a different agenda." And so the next morning, he got up, told Silas, and straightway they headed for the chief province of all of Macedon. And there in Philippi, they began preaching to anyone who would listen. We can rejoice over that specific revelation because that was the entry into what became Western Europe, from which the gospel came to America. It all began with God speaking to a sensitive preacher's heart who was not politically driven. He was driven for souls. Point number one, Paul and Silas were not politically driven. They had one thing in mind, reaching people for Jesus. Gentlemen, ladies, if we impart to you any thought other than that you ought to be about the mission God has called you to, then we will have failed. We're not here to make little politicians out of all of you or to set up little political networks in your churches. Our driving motivation must always be Jesus and nothing less. Paul and Silas were not politically driven. Number two, Paul and Silas were out preaching. A young lady came up that everybody called a fortune teller. Some people were making a fortune off of her tragedy, and the end of her life was certain wreckage. She was in the process of destroying herself. You see, she was demon-possessed. Well, Paul and Silas weren't politically correct. They chose not to call her a fortune teller. They said, you're demon-possessed. And in the name of Jesus, they cast out that demon and set her free. It was the greatest day of her life, the best thing that had ever happened. For the first time, she met two men who cared about her, not what they could get from her. But I'll tell you, it was the worst day for Paul and Silas. The next thing we see is they're summarily rounded up by the business community, men who had profited off this young lady's life, who had conspired with local magistrates. They were dragged out to the middle of the city and beaten within an inch of their life. Clearly, they were not politically connected. So here are men that are not politically driven, not politically correct, not politically connected, and the next moment we find them in the middle of a jail cell, in the bottom hole, in chains with their backs lacerated. And I want to remind all of you, contextually, this is a filthy, rat-infested environment where certainly disease was rampant. But we don't see two preachers moaning and complaining and saying, God, why me? Instead, we find them praying and then praising. And before long, God was moving throughout not only the jail, but the city. They were not politically driven. They were not politically connected. They were not politically correct. They were not politically dependent. Nor should we ever be. We're the church. We are the church. Now, Paul and Silas see God move through that jail. Suddenly, an earthquake. The doors spring open. Everybody's bonds are loosed. The jailer, supposing they'd all fled, prepared to kill himself. Paul said, do thyself no harm. We're all here. Even those others who had waited for the day they could escape were glued, held by the power of Almighty God. That jailer sprang in, called for a light. That's what lost people always do. They call for the light. Paul and Silas talked to him about Jesus. He took them to his own home, knowing it would likely cost him his life. And there Paul and Silas had their wounds dressed. But in the meantime, God is moving through the city. The magistrates, recognizing an earthquake, began to examine their own lives out of fear and said, hey, you know, we beat those two guys yesterday. We didn't follow procedure, protocol. We need to clean this up. So they did what politicians often do. They sought to sweep it all under the rug. Just get them out of town, and the problem is solved. And you know what most preachers would have done? They'd have tucked tail and run. Man, they would have bragged down the road about how God had delivered them. But not Paul and Silas. They were not politically driven. They were not politically correct. They were not politically connected. They were not politically dependent. But lo and behold, we discover they're not politically ignorant either. You see, Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul declared to the magistrate, or to the messenger, you go tell the magistrates we're not going anywhere. I'm a Roman citizen. I've got rights. And Paul recognized that he was uniquely blessed to have been born with Jewish training and upbringing. He understood the revelation of Jesus Christ because of divine interruption of his life. He'd been called to preach, but of all the countries and nations and times, he was placed in a certain period where the Roman rule, the Pax Romana, enabled him to carry on as a citizen with rights purchased by the blood of others. And he understood that he had every right to stand in those rights. Gentlemen, there's where it's breaking down for us. Many of us have forgotten that we were not just saved, we were saved in a free country. God blessed us with the freedom to preach and teach and live our lives. But we're about to be the first generation to give to our heirs something less than was given to us. In fact, you understand America can't survive if we don't wake up now and stand up and assert our rights before the magistrates and once again say we have a right to preach on anything. John Stemberger would tell you that you do have that right. But we have a right to call politicians into account. We have a right to stand up against the great sin of our culture and our age. In my lifetime, gentlemen, we've gone from my 3 sons to 2.5 men. Think about that. We've gone from my little Marjorie to Lady Gaga. We've gone from Father Knows Best to the Big Bang Theory. Jerry Lewis to Jerry Seinfeld. Leave It to Beaver to Beavis and Behindhead. True Grit to Brokeback Mountain. Frank Sinatra to gangster rap. And look at our schools. Once the envy of the world. Now we have graduates who can't read the diplomas they're given. 50% dropout rates higher in some cities. Prayer is out, cops are in. Bible studies out, Islamic studies are in. 10 Commandments come down, metal detectors go up. Creationism is out. Evolution is in. And let me just say a word about that. We now have an educational system that teaches the fact of God as theory and the theory of evolution as fact. Sex education is nothing more than the facilitation of fornication, complete with home study with some of the teachers in many cities. And when is it going to stop? When enough preachers, enough men of God who fear God more than man stand up and say, enough is enough. That is what today is all about. For me, that day came in 1992, in March of that year. I'd just gone to First Baptist Church of Pearland 18 months before that, and boy, were we having ourselves a time. I'd been an evangelist for 14 years previous. I'd conducted more than 500 crusades in America, all from little churches to the largest. God had blessed the work, but as kids got older, life became more complicated, so we began praying for God to open the door to pastor, and graciously He did. I've got a throat lozenge in my mouth, and I'm going to break a tooth if I'm not careful. I'm going to slow down. And then hopefully, it won't. If it comes out as a projectile, you duck. But I'm going to watch it. I'm going to slow down. One day, after the first in the 18th month of that wonderful ministry, we had baptized 500 into the church, and the church was really moving out. Man, all I was thinking about is how to win souls and how to build buildings to hold them. Lady walked out the back door of the church, said, "Preacher, are you going to the high school assembly tomorrow?" Well, I didn't even know there was one. But after I investigated a little bit, I decided to send Rod Compton to check it out. Rod was my staff member for over 13 years in 2 different churches. I used to brag. I was just like Moses. I leaned on my rod and my staff because he was both. So Rod went to that assembly. He came back to my office, and all he could say was, "Preacher, you just wouldn't believe it." He would not tell me what he heard. He literally wouldn't repeat the words. So I handed off a prospective staff member we had in that I was interviewing for lunch to him, and I went to the 5th of the 5 assemblies. Sat down on the back row of this lecture hall where there were 400 plus stationary desks. The young lady, all the students filed in. Then the young lady came out who was giving her speech. She had been in schools all over Harris County, had caused enough of an uproar that they had sent a slip home that most parents never saw that said, "If you don't want your child to be in this assembly, sign this form, send it back, and we'll hold them out for study hall." Most parents never saw that form, including the pastor who had 2 children, 2 high school kids of his own. I'm sure that day going home on Friday, my daughter who was driving the car looked at my son who was a 10th grader. She probably said something like, "Do you think we ought to tell Dad about it?" He probably said, "Well, you know, Daddy will get all bent out of shape." So they decided to spare me the pain and the trauma. Now, let me rest your minds. They were both great kids. but we'd moved in the middle of their my daughter's junior year. It was a difficult time of transition, and I'm sure they just didn't want their father to create the ruckus they thought he might create, so they spared me the trauma. To illustrate why teenagers need parents, they thought they could go to a 3,000-member church on Sunday and nobody would tell their dad about the assembly. Well, we elected, my wife and I, not to say a word. Wouldn't you know it, the assembly I attended, Misty was there. She was seated right up in front of the speaker, could not see me, but I could see her. The young lady was talking about every kind of sex act you can imagine, and a lot you shouldn't imagine. Her only premise was, hey, kids, whatever you want to do is fine. Don't judge anybody else. If you don't want to do it, that's good too. But if you're going to have sex, use a condom. In fact, she told those kids the safest form of sex was the kind our former president practiced in the Oval Office with an intern because they couldn't get pregnant. That was what she said. Well, the longer she spoke, the angrier I got as a pastor and as a father. But I sat there thinking, well, I don't want to embarrass Misty, so I'll just handle this through proper channels. But when she pulled out a condom and blew it up like a balloon and then made a couple of lewd remarks about the size of the male organ, told one dirty joke, I decided enough is enough. So I raised my hand. And she called on me very courteously. I was dressed in a suit. She probably thought I was a principal. I said, ma'am, where did you get that statistic? When the word ma'am rolled off my tongue, I could see Misty. She almost passed out. She had no clue I was in the audience. But I'm out there now, and I said, ma'am, where did you get that statistic? She said, the CDC. Went right back into her planned remarks. Now, I was likely the only one present that understood that she was referring to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. And the only reason I knew that is because God had sovereignly prepared me for this moment, unbeknown to me. You see, AIDS was still being called GRIDS in 1992, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency Syndrome. And I, like many other pastors, was reading everything I could find about this new disease that was rapidly spreading in the gay community. And I was asking and looking for information, and I'd read what the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia had said about condoms. They didn't purport condoms to be anywhere near as effective as what she presented that day when she said 94% effective. You see, the condoms that are that effective are the ones you buy at the pharmacy, not at the truck stop. They're kept at room temperature, not in a glove box of a car or some young man's back wallet that he sits on half a day. So I knew her facts were wrong. And I raised my hand a second time. You know what she did? She ignored me. You know what's hard to ignore? A Baptist preacher in a setting like that with his hand up. The whole crowd was communicating. Who is that? That's the Baptist preacher. That's Misty's dad. It was rifling through the audience. So finally, she stopped a second time. She said, yes, sir. Only this time she was very obviously upset. She said, yes, sir. I said, ma'am, I've read everything the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia has printed on this subject, and they don't purport condoms to be that effective. In fact, they don't say they're that effective in preventing pregnancy, and a male sperm is 100 times larger than the AIDS virus. Well, she knew I had my facts. She broke out in red splotches, didn't know what to say. I wanted to go up and hug her. She looked like she needed a hug to me as a pastor. But a lady stood up across the room and shouted, I've read the same statistic in a teen magazine, and it's true. I sat down in my seat. I began just to shake my head and fight back the tears as I thought about how many kids would die as a result of that assembly. But I tape recorded the whole thing. I had a pocket recorder. I went back to my office and I called a local attorney by the name of Cactus Cagle. I said, Cactus, wouldn't you like to be in his? He's now a judge, by the way. Wouldn't you like to go to that court? Judge Cactus. I said, Cactus, I secretly recorded a high school assembly. If I make it public, will I be sued? He said, well, preacher, in Texas, high school assembly is public information. You can do whatever you want to do. So I called in our minister of miscellaneous, and I had him, I called our janitor. I said, I want you to put on the signboard, if you want to hear what kids heard at PHS, Pearland High School, come Sunday morning. You talk about a church growth strategy. The place was packed. Now, guys, I was born at night, but not last night. I am first, foremost, an evangelist. So I just laid aside the 13-page transcript. I picked up an old revival sermon, breathed some life into it. I preached hell hot, heaven sweet, Jesus saves, gave a gospel invitation. We had about 7 adults saved that morning. But maybe all these folks are checking their watch, and boy, they're beginning to wonder, well, I thought he was going to talk about AIDS. I sat them all down after the last song. I said, here's the transcript, and I'm going to read it word for word, 4-letter words and all. Be warned. If you want to get your children out, you have 5 minutes. I dismissed them. Very few people left. I read the transcript to those people in that packed auditorium, overflow auditorium, and I'm telling you, never in my entire life have I seen a bunch of Baptists get so mad. There's a lot more to the story, but very little time to tell it. But let me give you the net effect. I wound up speaking to the school board before 600 people who showed up. Had to move it 4 times to accommodate the crowd. They had the deck stacked. They had 6 other speakers after me. They assumed they knew what I would say, and they had a couple of students, a couple of teachers, and another preacher lined up to make me look like a fool. Folks, in the first place, I'm not against sex education. I had sex education when I was in the 8th grade. They took all the boys in the boys' gym, all the girls in the girls' gym, blacked out the windows with tar paper, turned the lights off, showed us 60 millimeter projection images of people with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted diseases. When the lights came back on, it took us 2 years of married life to get over that 1 hour of sex education. They basically said, you do this, you'll get that. There was never, not one day in my life that I wanted to go insane, have my nose fall off or my teeth fall out. And so it honestly worked pretty good. It worked better for the girls than the boys, and they took care of the boys. Well, I want to assure you sex education isn't that now. The assumption is every kid's going to do it, so let's just facilitate it. As a result of that day when I stood before the school board, several dramatic things happened to me personally. In the first place, I learned for the first time politicians can count. Because those 7 stern-faced elected officials who were angry at me for causing what became a national media circus, in the course of my remarks, I was interrupted about 10 times with standing ovations, and every time they stood, the more those politicians began to smile. And it wasn't long until they were on my side. Because they could count the votes. And in fact, some of them were my friends. Many of these were, I don't mean then, they became my friends. These were good people who'd run for an office that didn't pay, and all they got for it was flack when something went wrong. But they were trying to do what they could do to advance education in our community. But you see, the church never came until we got mad. So we made some changes. The principal, by the way, got fired for other official reasons. An abstinence-based principal, a principal who advocated abstinence-based education, was brought in. I was asked to name 4 members to the committee that rewrote the sex education curriculum. We bought $4,000 worth of Christian materials and put in the library about sex education as a church, a gift to them. But the most important thing is I began to release our people to run for public office. And you know what happened? In 2 election cycles, we had 4 of the 7 school board positions elected right out of our church, and it effected change in that school. We soon had 3 of our members serving on the city council out of 5. Then some businessmen said, could this be done in Harris County? And I said, well, sure, just get enough pastors to agree. And so we had a series of luncheons over the course of a year, just like we're doing right now in Florida. And we soon had 400 pastors committed in Harris County to register their people to vote, pass out voter guides before the election, preach 1 sermon on why Christians should vote as followers of Jesus, not as Republicans or Democrats, and number 4, lead their people to the polls. And you know what happened in '94? We had 52 races that we had privately targeted where we knew that there were men and women serving who were pro-choice and anti-family in their political philosophy. We won 51 out of 52 races, and we never endorsed a single candidate just by getting Christians to vote their values and putting in their hands those nonpartisan voter guides. And then someone said, well, I wonder if this could be done in Texas. A group of men got together and gave me a budget and turned me loose. We traveled all over the state of Texas in 2002, networked 2,500 pastors in that state. That was the year that Rick Perry was elected for the first time to a full term, having served 2 years after George Bush became the president, and he was the lieutenant governor. He was elected our governor, but in the process of getting him elected, and we didn't endorse his candidacy, he simply let it be known he was a born-again believer, and he is. But in the course of that election, both houses of the legislature went from pro-choice to pro-life for the first time since Reconstruction, and every statewide office holder for the first time in Texas history that was elected held a pro-life, pro-family view, and it all happened because 2,500 preachers agreed. We will register our people to vote. We will put in their hand voter guides, nonpartisan. We will preach 1 or 2 sermons on why Christians should vote as followers of Jesus, and I gave you a sermon you can preach this morning. And number 4, on the Sunday before Election Day, they would stand up and say, I've already early voted. How many of you have? Raise your hand. The rest of you, Sunday is your day. Gentlemen, we have been searching, crisscrossing this state. John and I have now spoken in about 22 events, and we've got 1 more tomorrow and 7 next week. We're looking for 2,500 senior pastors who will join us, 2,000 senior pastors who will join us in those 4 simple things. Simply register your people to vote. You have 3 or 4 more Sundays before voter registration closes. Get it done, guys. Number 2, put in your hand voter guides. Number 3, preach on why they should vote. Number 4, lead them to the polls. But you know what? If we do all of that and don't have revival, we might win an election, but we'll still lose the war. So, with that emphasis, Vision America has been calling the church to a prayer and fasting period. I want to show you about a 40-second videotape, and I'm through. When you come back to the tables, there'll be 4 packets on each table. Those are for senior pastors or the lead pastor from any church that's here. If there's enough and there are some left over, anyone is welcome to them. When you leave here during the break or after it's over, Vision America, and on behalf of the Florida Family Policy Council, has stacks of books. Get any 2 you would like as a senior pastor. If you're the lead pastor and the senior pastor's not here, help yourself. If there's enough books, anyone's welcome to them. These are simply materials that will help you, written by myself and others. They're there because we want to help you become everything God's called you to be. Please watch this video. Go to the website. Join us in getting our people to the polls and getting them on their face in prayer. Thank you very much.
Are you concerned about the future of America? You're not alone. All around us we see a nation spiraling down into an ungodly mess of secular humanism, immorality, corruption, deceit, and attacks on religious liberty. And many believe there's nothing that can be done to stop it. They're wrong. We can do something. In the midst of this national crisis, our call to action is clear. God spells it out for us in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. This is an offer we can't refuse because we know that God is faithful to do what He promises if we act in obedience. So we're asking pastors and congregations all over America to commit to 40 days of prayer, fasting, and action to save America. 40 days to humble ourselves before God. 40 days to repent and seek His face. 40 days to cry out to Him with one voice to save our land. 40 days to take action as He leads. We believe He will answer. Our 40-day observance begins on September 28th and ends on Election Day, November 6th. Will you join us? Prayer plus fasting plus action equals change. Join churches nationwide. Sign up at www.40daystosaveamerica.org.